might expect drug war criticism from flashy CEOs, billionaire activists, maybe even a former UN leader. But at the UN this week, you'll also find the likes of George Shultz.
If we're going to win the war against...
As U.S. Secretary of State, Shultz fought the war on drugs for Ronald Reagan.
The war on drugs has been going on for about 40 years. It is a failure.
Now he calls on the UN to admit defeat and open up its drug treaties.
These drug treaties have pretty much established a global prohibition policy. So all the member states pretty much have to follow this prohibition model.
Neil Franklin will be there too. He put himself on the front lines of the war on drugs in Maryland 30 years ago by joining a drug squad.
I saw this shady group of folks and I said, wow, this seems pretty neat. And let me give it a try. And so I put in a transfer and went in and started working undercover. I eventually started commanding drug task forces. I had 9 at one time for the entire eastern part of the state of Maryland. And now I'm responsible for hundreds of people being arrested every year. You know, the so-called war on drugs.
We're going to go on down this road until the whole nation realizes that drug addiction in the United States is under control.
Richard Nixon may have declared it. Reagan owned it.
Drugs are menacing our society.
And like any war, it took on a life of its own.
This is crack cocaine.
Has America become cocaine country? Cocaine country.
This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
Billions for enforcement, zero tolerance. Mandatory prison time.
So yeah, I drank the Kool-Aid. You know, I was rah, drug-free America. We can do it. Did a lot of damage, locked up a lot of people. Very, very few of those people had anything to do with violence.
And drug violence raged on. And in 2000, it claimed the life of a friend.
He was working undercover. He was buying cocaine. This drug dealer shot and killed him. And I started paying attention, and now I'm noticing that, you know what, addiction rates are going up. Hey, I thought this drug war was to bring that stuff down. Overdose deaths are skyrocketing. Incarceration, man, you know, going from 500,000 people in prison in the 1970s to 2.3 million people in prison.
Franklin had become a drug war critic.
And they just keep adding up and adding up and adding up. There's nothing, absolutely nothing good about these policies of prohibition. We need a system of regulation and control.
In drug-producing countries like Colombia, the war on drugs was a lot more like actual war.
I was president of Colombia probably in the worst period of the war on drugs. I mean, they really threatened our democracy, our institutions. They killed thousands of people.
Denuncia a los narcotraficantes.
Colombia was in the grips of Pablo Escobar, a drug lord who at his height supplied 80% of the cocaine flowing into the U.S. In the early 90s, Cesar Gaviria's administration moved against him.
The world's most notorious drug dealer is dead.
But other cartels immediately took his place. The war was only beginning. Billions of U.S. aid and Colombia's own blood and treasure was poured into destroying the cocaine supply.
What we have discovered is even with all the effort that we did and the U.S. and the international community did, what you see is the flow of drugs to the U.S. market and to the European markets is basically the same. This is taking us nowhere.
Gaviria will be at the UN pushing for reforms, aiming to put the cartels out of business.
Drugs are bad, but the problem, how to deal with them, is a problem of prevention, education, government controls, not the total ban.
Change is already happening. In Europe, it's medical distribution, decriminalization, harm reduction. In the U.S., pot is legal in 4 states, and Canada promises pot legalization nationwide.
Our position on legalizing, controlling, regulating marijuana.
I think Canada's going to do some good things. I think you're going to be the first major country to really have serious marijuana reform policy.
Few expect change at the UN this week.
It shocked me, make me a liar. But personally, I don't see it.
But growing ranks of disenchanted drug warriors now have a fight they think they can win.
I think we're looking at a similar scenario. When we ended alcohol prohibition back in 1933, it was the individual states that moved, one by one, saying we're no longer going to enforce these policies of alcohol prohibition. And eventually the federal government caught up with it. I see the same thing here globally.